As I've thought more about the metaphor of soil versus dirt, I don't love the idea that something could be classified as dirt, not worthy of bearing life, and something else can be classified as soil, because one of the things I learned at the farm is that everything is dynamic. Nothing is a fixed state. Ecosystems are constantly changing. Where we see dandelions growing, that's a pioneer species that doesn't need a ton of nutrients, but in coming to life and then in dying, it can improve what that person would call dirt and help turn it into good soil. So paying attention to the constantly changing conditions as well as the possibilities that every space holds, that's where I would rather focus.
Hey friends, welcome back to the Broken to Beloved podcast. If you're looking for compassionate conversations that provide practical resources to move toward healing and wholeness, then this is the place for you. Today, we're talking with Jeff Chu about his new book, Good Soil. Jeff is an award-winning journalist and editor-at-large at Travel+Leisure. He's the author of Does Jesus Really Love Me? And co-author with the late Rachel Held Evans of the New York Times bestseller Wholehearted Faith. Chu is a former Times staff writer and Fast Company editor whose work has also appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Wall Street Journal, and Modern Farmer. In his weekly newsletter, Notes of a Make-Believe Farmer, Chu writes about spirituality, gardening, food, travel, and culture. He lives with his husband Tristan in the Grand Rapids, Michigan area. Friends, you are going to love this conversation. It is right up my alley. And so, here is my conversation with our new friend, Jeff. Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Brian.
I'm so glad to have this time with you. I loved the book, Good Soil. I love anything having to do with dirt or growing things or, oddly enough, compost. So when I heard about this theology of compost thing, I knew I had to get in on it. I think I learned about it through Emily Freeman, who I think you're doing an event with soon. And I just appreciate her work as well. And just thought, boy, if there's someone asking good, hard questions about things and asking us to reconsider our theology, our faith, the way we do life through a different lens, I love to do that kind of work. So I'm excited to jump in.
Thank you so much.
You mentioned, I think it was a written interview maybe with Aaron Moon, who we just talked to about cutting a chapter out on the difference between dirt and soil. Can you tell us more about that differentiation?
I think while I was at the Farminary, because the book is really about my time at Princeton Seminary's farm, I posted something on Instagram about digging in the dirt because you get that nice alliteration, right? Mm-hmm. And I believe it was the daughter of a soil scientist who got really irritated with me and got me in the comments and kind of called me out for talking about digging in the dirt and felt very strongly that I was actually digging in the soil. And I thought it was an interesting distinction. And as I've thought more about the metaphor of soil versus dirt. Look, this isn't scientific, right?
That's okay.
I don't love the idea that something could be classified as dirt, not worthy of bearing life, and something else can be classified as soil, because one of the things I learned at the farm is that everything is dynamic. Nothing is a fixed state. Ecosystems are constantly changing, right? Where we see dandelions growing, that's a pioneer species that doesn't need a ton of nutrients, but in coming to life and then in dying, it can improve what that person would call dirt and help turn it into good soil. So paying attention to the constantly changing conditions as well as the possibilities that every space holds, that's where I would rather focus.
Mm-hmm. I have friends who tried their hand at restorative farming. And so their kind of little motto was life begins in the dirt. And this whole idea that it takes work to bring life back to dirt or to land that has been used or overused or abused for whatever purposes. So what does it look like to bring animals back on the land, to cultivate the land, not for the purpose of crops or, quote, growing things for selling, but just to make the land richer again. And so ever since my experience with them and getting to visit and just a couple of days just going to show up and help and see what it takes to do the work, it's just been such an eye-opening experience for me to know how much is happening on the stuff that we walk on and just don't pay any attention to.
There is a world beneath our feet.
Such a world.
It's amazing and humbling when you think about how much is going on beyond our perception. I think that's also why my professor at the Farmhandy, Nate Stuckey, so emphasized that the primary focus of our work as farmhands and as students was not growing flowers or making bouquets or even raising chickens. It was producing good soil. We had the chickens, he reminded us, because we would move the chicken tractor where they were living from area to area so that their poop would enrich the land, so that for the future of those 21 acres, there would be more opportunity, that it would flourish. We were seeking the flourishing of another.
And I specifically remember doing that, is moving the tractor with him and resetting up the fences in an area. It's like, well, we're going to move, or eventually they got cows and doing the same thing and moving the fences for the cows. You talked about Nate and how he insisted the primary crop would be good soil. And I love that he said this, or you say, life ultimately gets the last word, he said, but the only way you move along the path to the fertile soil is if you go through the cycle of life and death, life and death. The compost pile was not merely a teaching tool or a prop, it was the point. And then you write so much beautiful stuff about the compost pile, which most people would ignore. But I have 3 of them in my backyard. And I've been listening to compost stuff and organic gardening and all these things. So I have such a passion for this, to pay attention to these kinds of things too. Tell us about your theology of compost for people who aren't familiar yet.
So it wasn't actually something that I was setting out to do to demarcate a theology, right? I think sometimes that word theology gets appropriated in academic settings to mean something that requires footnotes and that ends up in thick library books that sell like 5 copies. Theology is just the human attempt to make sense of what God might be doing in the world and who God might be. We're all theologians in a sense. We're all trying to make sense of things that are beyond us. When someone looks at the sky and the stars and wonders where they came from, that can be a theological act. When someone considers hospitality and what we might be communicating about belonging, that can be a theological act. And so the theology of the compost is really something that just happened because Nate drew my attention to the compost, and honestly, I had to give a talk and I didn't have any other ideas. I'm not going to make it more grand than it actually was. And our theologies build on what's been given to us, right? So Nate gave me the gift of this introduction to the compost pile. And a friend shoved me in front of a microphone and said I had to have something to say for 20 minutes. And here I had an illustration of what I think God is doing in the world, which is resurrecting things and encouraging us as God's beloved to participate in that process of identifying the things that are of death, surrendering them to the spiritual compost pile or the literal compost pile, and then accepting that there are forces beyond us that will collaborate to turn those things of death to things of flourishing. We don't get to do it on our own. We don't get to do any of it on our own. We are not autonomous, self-made creatures. So that's really a key component of the theology of compost, is recognizing that relationship is written into all of this and acknowledging how small we are, not in a bad way, but in a beautiful way, that we get to be part of something so much bigger, so much more loving, so much more filled with grace than we can be individually.
Thank you. You write about how uncomfortable you are in front of a microphone, and yet you've made it your vocation now. And I listened to the talk that you gave, and I don't want you to be so quick to dismiss that it's something I came up with because I had to talk for 20 minutes, because it so deeply resonated with the crowd you were in front of. And now, obviously, with a whole nother audience with this book, that there is truth in it. You talk about parables, and the power of parables is that you just find this truth that resonates deeply in something that gets illustrated so simply. And I even appreciate the kind of reframing on the parable of the good soil, that it's not necessarily good versus bad, healthy versus unhealthy, sinners and saints. And I deeply resonated with the idea of, well, I just need to work harder. It's up to me to make this good soil. What makes soil good for you today?
I think part of what was so isolating about the childhood interpretation of the parable of the sower that I was brought up with, this Baptist idea that you have to be the good soil or else, is that it was so rooted in threat and fear. Somehow I had to make choices that would identify me as good soil. And a more ecological reading of that parable teaches that all of these things are in process. The thorns that are growing on a depleted piece of land can help to enrich the soil. The grass even that withers in the hot sun, by giving its life, if you want to put it that way, right? By saying, this is my body given for you, gives itself up to future flourishing. And there's such a picture of community and relationship and interdependence, but also this long timeline. Those of us who care about things of justice, those of us who care about human flourishing, sometimes I think can be overwhelmed by this sense that it's all on us and it all has to get done on a certain timeline. And there's such liberation in recognizing the long game, that we can only do what we can do. And that the we is the key component in that, right? The we includes not just each individual human, but also a God who has promised to redeem all things. We don't know on what timeline. It honestly doesn't make sense to me how, but that's the hope. That's the hope and the sense of possibility that I cling to. And that's what enables me to look out on a field that has been mistreated, like the fields at the farminary were. It was a topsoil farm. So with every harvest, there was a layer of goodness that was being shipped off to someone else's yard. That exploited thing could will once again be good soil. And it's weird, unless you're familiar with the Psalms, to say that the fields will testify or that the trees will preach a sermon. But that's what those things did for me as someone who had been through some stuff in my life, to receive the testimony of the fields and the sermons that the trees were able to preach. That pointed me toward the possibility of good soil, both literally and figuratively, in my own life.
I appreciate, and I'm hearing the emphasis on relationship and community. And there seems to be such a Western and maybe specifically American concept of I versus we, right? And you write, to emphasize what's mine can be to underplay the importance of what's ours. And there's a dozen other quotes I could talk about that pull the I from the we. But tell us about the importance of the interconnectedness of relationship, community, what that does for good soil, what that does for us.
Part of it is returning most, if not all of us, to our cultural roots. Because if you look back in history, there are very few societies that were ever as individualistic as modern American society. Most of us, if you trace our ancestry far back enough, come from little villages where you had to be intermeshed with your neighbor because a flood, the sun, whatever the weather conditions were, you were all subject to the same forces and you were all in it together. Chinese culture, my family's from Hong Kong and southern China, is a deeply communal culture. And that can be toxic in its own ways. But the gift of reclaiming some of my familiarity with Chinese culture over the years is recognizing that Chinese philosophy and Chinese culture have long held that we flourish together, that goodness is collective, that honor is something that is part of belonging. That matters to me so much. And it's a real antidote, I think, in the best possible way to some of the toxicity that I feel like we're seeing right now, that is so much about what's mine. What can I accumulate that's mine? that belongs to me that can improve my standing in the world. I could go on about it for a long time, but
I could sit and listen to it for
basic.
a long time. Well, and you say, in responding to pain and suffering, that's like, who can afford the pretense of independence then? Right. And it's just, there is such a need for community. And what I'm finding in the spaces of specifically spiritual abuse, or where we discover and find harm in faith communities, is that healing has to happen in community. It's not something I can do on my own, that I need that interdependence on other people to help me to regulate, to rise out of this feeling of being shut down, to not feel so isolated and alone in my pain. I love the way that you shared the story at the Pool of Bethesda, and that the Greek that is normally translated well or healed might be more precise to say whole. In our modern understanding, we think it means get healed so you can take up your mat and walk. But in a cultural context, that not being whole meant that he had no one to take him to the pool, and that to be made whole is to be restored to community and returned to relationship. I loved that take, and I've never heard that before. Would you tell us more about how you arrived there?
Honestly, I stand on the shoulders of others who have done really good scholarship and theological inquiry about stories of disability, because so much of disability is not really fundamentally about how a person's body works. It's about the architecture and the infrastructure that set someone apart as other. So when our buildings, when our public spaces, when our communal areas aren't set up for another person's flourishing, that's what marks them out as other. And in the case of this man, what he needed was a friend. What he needed was belonging. What he needed was an answer and a balm for his isolation. For those of us who have experienced spiritual trauma, spiritual abuse, physical abuse, I think one of the real challenges is that our wounds were inflicted in community. Our wounds were inflicted in relationship. And so we believe the story that I have to get away from those places to heal. And it might seem tempting. It certainly is tempting for me as a shy introvert to think that I can find my flourishing by myself because around others I've been so hurt. The truth, though, is ultimately, if the wounds were inflicted in community, the healing has to come in community. We were made for community. And saying we can go it alone is never going to give us the wholeness that we seek, because we can't be whole apart from others.
Yes, I'm more and more often finding that to be true. For people who don't know how to reconnect to community, or who feel so unsafe because of what happened to them in the context of community, how do we find that again?
I'm scared of people. Look, I'm not going to lie about that. I was bullied as a kid. I do not naturally trust. One of the beautiful things about the farm was that it allowed me not to be around other people, but I was constantly around other creatures. And in a sense, I would say the heron in the pond, the Canada geese, the chickens that we raised, Lincoln, the farm dog that I became friends with, even the vegetables, because I'm the weirdo who will talk to the vegetables that are growing in the garden. They helped me to relearn how to be in constant relationship with others. And then when someone else was in the fields, someone else was weeding alongside me, there was an on-ramp, because we were in the company of the flowers and the vegetables and the bees and the butterfly, right? That's a form of community and relationship as well. I'm not saying you just suddenly have to go to a church coffee hour and throw yourself in. That doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
But there is a way of learning to recognize beauty again. There is a way of reacquainting yourself with the goodness of companionship. There is a gentle way that I think God has written into creation, even through dogs, right? The unconditional love of dogs that reminds us, I actually am more capable of trust than I realize. I am more capable of vulnerability. We got a shelter dog at the beginning of the pandemic. A shelter dog doesn't come with any guarantee. There was no promise that Fozzie would never have a bad day or a reactive moment and maybe bite us, right? Or growl. Yet somehow my husband and I were willing to open ourselves to the relationship, to the possibility that something beautiful could grow. And it did. And even then, after a year, after 2 years, there was no pledge that Fozzie wouldn't do something that we thought was out of character. That's how relationship works. Mm-hmm. And the relationship with Lincoln, the farm dog, with Fozzie, our shelter dog, who accompanied me through the writing of this book, these relationships forced me to confront the reality that I had more capacity for love that wasn't specifically canine, right? But that could be extended even to people who annoy me, even to people I'm scared of, even to people who have the capacity to hurt me.
I want to go back eventually to the idea of being othered and to reclaiming culture and heritage, but I want to chase this thought first. Relearning to believe that love is for me. Because you write, it's taken me many, many years to learn how to receive love. Though love might surround you and even bombard you, it can feel meaningless if you lack the capacity to believe that love could be for you. I also grew up in an environment that spoke love very differently, if at all, right? I can probably count on one hand the number of times my parents have verbalized their love for me, but I have still learned to feel it and receive it and express it. And for those, like we've been saying, who have experienced abuse by those who are meant to love and care for them, it becomes even more difficult. And I love that idea of finding this slow and gentle on-ramp to encountering beauty, to recognizing a capacity for love, whether it's through the farm dog in Lincoln or through your shelter dog in Fozzie. How did you learn through those processes to believe again that love is for you and that you have the capacity to return it?
I still have to relearn it every day.
Yeah.
I think it's actually a discipline to open yourself to love, because love can lead to grief. Love can lead to whatever vulnerability produces, right? Love means you can get hurt sometimes because life is life and this world is broken. Mm-hmm. I have to remind myself every day, and often the reminders don't come from me. So for instance, before we started this conversation, my best friend texted me just to check in. And learning to be loved means I was honest with him about how I'm doing. I didn't just say I was doing great because I'm tired today, right? And there are things that are weighing on my mind. And being willing to express honesty when someone checks in is an act of the discipline of learning to be loved. Cooking a good meal, even if, say, my husband is out of town, for myself, something that is healthy, that will bring me delight, that will make my body feel good, not just in the moment, but maybe like 12 or 24 hours later. That's an act of love that I have to choose. We have to choose love in very concrete and specific ways. I have to believe that I'm worthy of that nourishing and healthy dish, that I am worthy of that investment in my future self. My husband definitely helps. He will tell me things that I don't necessarily believe when he says them. Yeah. For instance, if he says I'm beautiful, most of the time I honestly don't feel beautiful. What does it mean to quiet my nastiest inner voice long enough to hear him, to not make him out to be a liar, and to receive that gesture of love? It's hard sometimes. It's challenging some days. Yeah. This is part of the predicament of being human. And we keep going one moment after another, one day after another. One of the most helpful things for me concretely has been to look around at the world. I can see this maple tree right outside my window, and I can just start to see some buds on. The fact that I get to witness this maple tree at the beginning of springtime is grace. I'm talking to you. Yeah, I'm doing some thinking, but I'm not forcing my heart to beat. I'm not pushing the blood through my veins and my arteries. That is evidence of grace. I did nothing to deserve this body that for now is working mostly for me. The tulips and the daffodils, we have some coming out in our yard that I can see. The daffodils, I just cut some yesterday afternoon, the first daffodils of the season. Sure, I planted the bulbs. I dug some holes last November, roughly. Everything else, it was the soil and the microbes, the bulb itself, the rain, the sunshine. That's grace. I've been in this years-long process of training myself to recognize beauty and acknowledge grace. And underneath that beauty and grace, I choose to see love. And if we genuinely believe that we're surrounded by love, that we're held by love, in a sense, I think that increases our capacity to recognize our belovedness and then to put that out into the world so that others too can experience some beauty and some grace. But as I said, it's a moment by moment, day by day discipline.
And it can be utterly overwhelming.
It can be overwhelming.
We're not ready to receive it.
Sometimes you just need to crawl in bed and go to sleep. That's love too.
That is love too. That is absolutely love too. Thank you for that answer. It is just beautiful to consider how much around us and in us is truly grace. And that these graces, as small or large as they may be, are underpinned by this sense of love. And to be able to welcome that and to be open to receiving these things that just surround us all the time, I think will be really helpful. This idea of being othered, and I love appreciate the work of Janai Alman and so many others who have been writing about this and talking about it. I experienced it so much growing up in blue collar, middle class suburbia outside Pittsburgh, and just feeling like the only minority in a high school of, I don't know, I think there were 1,600 of us. And when I go back through my yearbook, I find other faces that I am shocked to see there because I don't remember them. It felt like I was the only one, right? And so I spent so much time, and you write about this too, it's like this whole idea of it would just be easier if I were white. It would just be so much easier. And so part of that for me is also the distancing of myself from my culture or from my ethnicity or from my race. And so I loved the way that you write about classical Chinese poetry or reclaiming old practices around Chinese New Year or trying to learn recipes from your mother or remember them from your grandmother. What does it mean to you to reclaim these practices and that heritage?
This is my inheritance. And like anything else, right? We can choose to honor it or we can choose to leave it in a box gathering dust. Because of the way American society has trained us, because of the devices in our hands, right, that show us images of what is beautiful, what is valued, what gets the most likes, what's hot. That has skewed our relationship with our bodies, with our cultures, with the richness of diversity. And I think part of the work that I've had to do is really, again, I'm going to use this word that is not popular. It's discipline. Honoring what has been dishonored, even by me. Exploring, being curious, not being willing to settle for the most superficial understanding. And then fundamentally asking my 5th grade bully Mac, whose name still comes to mind all the time, along with the nasty things he did and said based on the shape of my eyes and the texture of my hair. How much power am I going to continue to give Mac over this wealth that I've inherited from my ancestor, over this body that God has given me? Isn't there something inequitable about the fact that I allow him some moments to have a larger voice in my life than the God who I believe loves me, than the grandma who made me fried rice to show her affection because she didn't really know how in words, than the parents who, despite their struggles with my sexuality, invested so much in me, both materially and emotionally, because I'm their son. Doesn't it seem unjust that the voices of those who have hurt us and told us that we are worthless should be louder than those of people in our lives who have said, we love you, you matter? And there's something in our wiring that amplifies one unhealthy voice and diminishes what's good.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to have to sit with that. There's so much there. And I think part of it has to do with the distancing, the utter dividing of self, right? To say, I don't want to have anything to do with that because I'd rather be like everyone else and to fit into the crowd. And then seeing the popularity of Chinese culture, or the celebrations of a Chinese or Lunar New Year, or the appropriation now of recipes and cultural things and heritage, where it used to be in America, I'm not American enough, and in Korea, I'm not Korean enough, so where do I fit in is nowhere. And now this beautiful blending of things that is happening a little more today for a new audience, a little, right?
They want the bibimbap. Do they want you?
The answer is not usually. They want the kimchi, but not as spicy or not in the way, because it's like the memories I have of friends or people like, oh my God, that stinks. What is that? That's so gross. And now everyone wants it. And there are so many conflicting emotions that come with that baggage, right?
Especially because H Mart is a lot more crowded now.
And now it has 3 aisles dedicated to Hispanic food or Indian food. It's like, what is happening? And it is this melting pot thing of recognizing the beauty in the diversity of the body of Christ, that we were always designed to be different on purpose and not homogenous and not the same. And I'm going back to the compost, that this idea of all these random things, not random, but all these completely different things, of shredded brown leaves and dried things, of ripping open disgustingly rotted liquefied salad kits, of weeds and plants and discarded and old things from the garden that turn into this unified humus and living organism of soil and compost, I think is, again, why it's such a powerful metaphor for what we're meant to look like.
You know, having 3 compost piles, that a healthy compost pile requires diversity. You cannot make good compost if you're only putting in, say, rotten salad. That will never produce healthy compost. Mm-hmm. You need a mix of things, and you need air, and you need microbes, and you need worms, and you need grubs, and you need this collaboration of incredible diversity to produce what will be life-giving, what will foster goodness. And I think it's a beautiful picture of how God intended life to work. Mm-hmm. There is beauty in the diversity, even if we have been culturally conditioned not to recognize it.
Yeah. Well, and you're right. I think it's even at the beginning of the book when you first show up to the farminary and you prejudge one of your other classmates. In prejudging, you'd written her off as not useful, quote unquote, for my education, and to dismiss anyone based on appearance or ethnicity or any other classification, including seeing someone as a basic white girl, whatever that means, was to reduce, dishonor, disrespect, and even dehumanize. And that passage just struck me because I know how many times I've done that to people too, and how I felt it done to me in different environments. In recognizing the need for diversity to produce something beautiful, how has that changed the way that you tend to approach new people or new relationships today?
I will tell you, the answer depends on what kind of day I'm having and how intentional I'm being.
Yes.
Because on a rough day, Wednesday, we were flying back from Texas. I was tired. I felt like I had poured myself out over the previous days. I was lacking in patience. And so I was inclined to see the folks who were rushing through the airport, not paying attention to others as obstacles, as really objects, inconveniences. So that's my not best self. That's the self that does not recognize relationship, does not honor the belovedness in these folks whose names I will never know, whose stories I don't get to experience, except for that moment where they cut in front of me in line. At my best self, when I have a little more capacity for compassion, I can see, oh, well, maybe they're having a bad day too. And then in the rarest of moments, when I am rested and feel full of compassion, I can even see the person who oppresses me, the person who has hurt me, as I think I would like to, which is as God's beloved, as a person who bears no more and no less of the imprints of God's love on their person as I do. And that is everyone, at least according to my theology. Mm-hmm. And it's a very inconvenient and annoying truth sometimes. If I believe that God loves all, that includes folks who are doing horrible things and who have done horrible things. So it depends on the day and it depends on the moment, but That's what I aspire to.
Yeah. And what I appreciate is the willingness to be honest about it and to be aware of it. Because I think so many of us just float through life on cruise control thinking that we are these magnanimous creatures, just not realizing that we're just completely bowling over these people or dismissing them because they don't fit our needs or whatever it is. And for me, what draws me to the work is that openness and that capability to be self-aware and to recognize, hey, this is not a great day for me. And here's why. And so I recognize, and I also know what I need right now.
Part of being human is that we have an incredible capacity to hurt other people. And I worry that sometimes those of us who have been so wounded because, and I speak from lifelong experience, because we can become so accustomed to wallowing in that place of woundedness, we fail to recognize the power that we have, which is the power to hurt others, but also the power to bless others.
Yeah.
We give up so much power because we don't recognize that it's there for us to make choices about.
I love that. You said recently, your friend Kate asked you a question about self-care, and you said how bad you are at self-care and that you intend, but I loved, you said, I intend to stay that way because you only need self-care when there's a lack of community care. And I think for people who have been hurt, that it's really easy to feel isolated. And again, going back to that idea of needing connection and needing relationship to find healing, I love that idea of community care versus just self-care and intending to stay bad at it because I want to rely on a community. What does that look like for you right now?
Again, I don't have any shortcuts to this.
Yeah.
Right? So Kate is someone I've known for years. And our communal care has taken the shape of mutual investment over those years. She loves weird Asian potato chips. So I send her weird Asian potato chips. Maybe once a year, I'll send her a giant box of Lay's chips from Thailand that have strange flavors like prawn laksa or fried chicken. There's a fried chicken potato chip. She sends, not just to me, but I know to other friends, toffee from North Carolina, from a small business that makes toffee. And it's gotten to the point where my husband is like, hey, when are we getting some toffee from Kate? And that offhand comment from my husband is a recognition, in a sense, of ongoing communal care because he's experienced it, we've experienced it, and we've come to hope in it. I'm going to be in North Carolina in a couple of days, and communal care for Kate looks like texting me and saying, hey, how about after your work is done, you come over and we'll order a pizza and watch bad TV. I say it didn't happen overnight because I think sometimes in American society, as accustomed as we are to door dashing everything and things being packaged with convenience, like anything else, communal care takes mutual work.
Yeah.
It takes time. It doesn't happen instantly. It can't happen instantly.
Yeah.
And so part of communal care is not just receiving communal care, but creating the right conditions where you can be cared for, investing in relationship, reaching out to others, taking the 10 seconds it takes to just say, I'm thinking of you today. No reply needed, such that over time, those expressions of love accumulate and deepen. And when you really need it, someone might even sense, oh, I've got to show up for Brian. I want to know what's going on. I want to meet him where he is. Yeah, I wish we could just go to the store and buy communal care. That's not how it works.
No, it's not. Well, and it's like the compost. It's like it takes intentional work and it takes the waiting of the process, the patience to cultivate that sort of a thing. And I think for people who are feeling lost or isolated, it can feel like a wilderness. And I loved the way that you wrote about the wilderness, because this was another thought I hadn't considered before, that often we see it as a place of banishment, exile, or punishment. But then you reframe it as a place of divine encounter and spiritual restoration, which was such a beautiful thought. Would you tell us more about that?
Part of it is my observation when I was prepping a sermon one day that Luke tosses in this seemingly offhand line that Jesus withdrew to the deserted places to pray.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make sense that the wilderness should be a barren environment if that is where Jesus went to pray. That means it's a place of restoration, a place of possibility, a place of a kind of healthy human solitude. But then when you look at the historical record, you see all the places too that talk about the things that make home in the desert. So once again, you're not alone if you're paying attention, because there are birds. There might be a lizard that scuttles under the rock. There are very hardy and resilient plants. And I think it's attentiveness. That's what I'm hoping people will draw from this book most of all, is attentiveness to what else could be happening. Attentiveness to the other creatures that might be able to tell us a better story. Attentiveness to the sense of possibility that we might have if we spent the energy that we so often focus on spinning or spiraling or obsessing about the ways in which we're insufficient. If we turned that energy and noted the sufficiency that surrounds us, just maybe not in the places we've been looking.
And speaking of places we haven't been looking, also the chapter on potato. That I forget that I have this potato in the crisper drawer, and here it is sprouting in the darkness, right? And you wrote, if you're not going to eat us, we're going to do what we know how to do. And that each little piece of potato was its own little Easter story, every one the embodiment of resurrection. And this idea, I don't think this part is in your book, you talk about planting them, but the idea that you need to keep mounding dirt on potatoes as they continue to grow, and you keep heaping them and putting them into the darkness. And you're right that darkness can be a friend. So often it feels like darkness in these seasons. Tell us about that darkness being a friend.
Part of this learning really comes from the Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney, who is a biblical scholar at Bright Divinity School, an outstanding biblical scholar who has done so much work to reframe some of our common tropes about light and darkness, and that habit of seeing light as good and darkness as bad. When you combine Will Gaffney's scholarship and the testimony of nature itself, you have to recognize that sometimes light is bad and darkness is good, that things are not nearly so simple, that humanity, the womb, is a place of darkness that we need to grow, that a potato plant, those tubers require darkness, and light, in fact, will make them poisonous. It's all about the conditions that we need at a particular time in a particular season to flourish. It's not as simple as we would like to have it be sometimes. So recognizing the complexity, right, that is written into nature itself, I think was a real key in unlocking the possibilities of the metaphor of the potato and how it grows, and learning from it, as I've tried to learn from so many other things in the garden.
I love that. The worm.
The worm.
One of our values at Broken to Beloved is this idea of goodness over wickedness, that we were created with the original intent and the gift of being called very good. And yet we see, and you talk about this theology of utter depravity and worm theology, and how Calvin thought he was condemning humankind by describing man as a 5-foot worm. And then you do this beautiful work to reframe the work of the lowly worm. Would you tell us more about that?
This really came out of having had traditional worm theology inflicted on me for so many years. I went to a Christian school for high school that was very much Calvinist. And you hear over and over and over, you have to give your life to Jesus, because without Jesus, you're rotten to the core.
Yeah.
Your heart can't be trusted. Your every desire is wrong. There's that verse in Jeremiah, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, which means you shouldn't trust. You shouldn't trust yourself. You shouldn't trust other people. And that created in me this posture of constant fear that I wasn't good enough, fear that others were going to hurt me, fear all around, and then ultimate threat. The funny thing is, my way to a better worm theology went through Charles Darwin, because Darwin wrote his last book. I believe it was his last book that just came out before he died, about the power of the earthworm and his recognition, because he was so attentive to nature, that even before there was the technology of the Industrial Revolution that made things so much easier, the earthworm was already doing that work, aerating the soil, creating conditions in which other things could grow. So here, this guy is celebrating the worm. And I was trying to reconcile Calvin's very negative view of the worm and Darwin's very positive view of the worm, and trying to make sense of what a worm is actually designed to do. And what a worm is actually designed to do, it turns out, is to take things of death, rotten things we consider rubbish and waste, and it actually produces through its poop some of the best fertilizer in the world. What do you do with that metaphor? Well, as I read, it turns out John Calvin didn't know much about worms because he was a lawyer who grew up in the city and had no hands-on experience with agriculture. So who is he to be teaching us about worms and what they do and what they represent? For me, reclaiming the beauty and the integrity and the goodness of the worm helped to kind of unravel that old Calvinist reading of the worm stories. And there's an invitation there to say, yeah, I would actually love to be more like the worm, such that I could take in things that are negative and harmful and metabolize them. And what I put out into the world is nourishing and good. What an honor to be more like the worm.
What a gift. Thank you. I think one of my favorite lines to close us out is this idea that, we talk a lot about belovedness and this idea of leaning into our own identity and calling in the ways that we are all uniquely wired. You write that I'd always told myself I'd be a success in the kitchen if I could cook like my mother. And the real win, I realized, was that I had learned to cook like me. And I feel like that is such a gift. And for your sake, I'm so glad you found it and I identify with it. It's like we try so hard to be someone else, or to be what someone else expects us to be, or we try to meet the expectations or benchmarks of others. And it's when we finally realize how we have been gifted to give our expression, individual expression, for the good of others and the community. And I love the way that you put on these feasts for your friends and neighbors and loved ones, that contributes to what is happening around us. This book, Jeff, and your work is such a gift. Thank you so much for taking time with us. Where can people find you online?
My website is byjeffchu.com because some other Jeff Chu took jeffchu.com, so I had to add the BY at the beginning of it. I'm on Instagram also at byjeffchu, and I have a Substack newsletter that comes out almost weekly. It aspires to be weekly. It's called Notes of a Make-Believe Farmer, and it's at jeffchu.substack.com.
Thank you. It is lovely, and I wanted to ask a question about the umami stuff because it was wonderful, but I'll just tell people to go find it and read it. Everyone go get your copy, Good Soil, The Education of an Accidental Farmhand. Jeff, thanks again so much for being with us.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate all the good questions and the conversation.
Anytime I get to talk about dirt and compost and life in the soil and growing things and finding beauty, it is going to be a home run for me. If you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, be sure to follow Jeff and say thanks for being on the show. You can find links and all the things in the show notes. You can subscribe or follow the show to get new episodes automatically. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review or share with your friends. It helps us so much. As a 501c3 nonprofit, our work is made possible by our generous donors. If this has been helpful to you, consider joining us today at brokentobeloved.org/support. Coming up on the show, we have Michael Cusick, Amy Fritz, Hillary McBride, and so many more. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to listen. I hope it's been helpful. Here's to moving toward healing and wholeness together. I'll see you next time.